82%. That is the probability the United States government attached this week to an El Niño forming within the next 2 months. And the moment that number was published, almost every headline filed it as a weather story. A wet winter coming, a dry one somewhere else. I want to tell you as plainly as I can that this is not a weather story. It is a food story, and the world has not noticed. Because the last time the Pacific Ocean assembled the exact configuration now being forecast, the year was 1877, and 50 million people died. Not because one harvest failed, but because the harvest failed everywhere at once. So the question this video is built around is not whether El Niño is coming, it is whether the modern world quietly built its entire food supply on an assumption the Pacific is now poised to break. If a forecast that sounds like background noise can carry a history like that, you will want to stay for the whole picture. Take a second to like this video and subscribe to the Sky Lab, because we are going to be tracking this ocean all summer, and tell me in the comments which country you are watching from, and whether the price of food where you live has already started to move. Let's get into it. Part 1. The Pacific just changed its mind. Most people heard the words El Niño Watch this week and filed them somewhere in the back of their minds, in the same drawer where we keep the weather forecast and the pollen count. A watch. Something to keep an eye on. Probably means a wet winter somewhere, or a dry one somewhere else. And then they moved on with their day. I want to tell you, as gently and as clearly as I can, that this is one of the few times the headline genuinely undersells the story. Because what was announced this week is not really a weather story at all. It is a food story, and the world has not noticed. On May 14th, 2026, the Climate Prediction Center, the arm of the United States government that watches the tropical Pacific for a living, issued an El Niño Watch. That phrase has a specific technical meaning. It means the conditions that produce an El Niño are now expected to develop, and the agency wants everyone who depends on the forecast to start paying attention. The numbers attached to the watch were not vague. They put the probability of El Niño conditions emerging during the May through July window at 82%, and they put the probability of those conditions still being in place through the heart of winter, December 2026 through February 2027 at 96%. Read those two numbers again because they are doing a lot of quiet work. 82% that it arrives within weeks, 96% that once it arrives, it stays through winter. This is not a maybe. This is a forecast leaning hard in one direction, and the people issuing it do not lean unless the ocean is telling them to. Here is the part that makes it stranger. As of the middle of May, the ocean and the atmosphere were still, officially, in a state called ENSO neutral. Not El Niño, not La Niña, the in-between. The system is standing on the doorstep with its hand on the handle, but it has not actually walked through. The most recent weekly temperature reading from the key stretch of the equatorial Pacific that forecasters watch was somewhere around 0.4 of a degree Celsius above normal. That is still inside the neutral band. It has not crossed the line that would make this an official El Niño. But the direction is unmistakable. The Pacific has spent more than a year in a cool, La Niña-leaning mood, and now, for the first time in over a year, it has turned. It has changed its mind, and when the Pacific changes its mind, the rest of the planet eventually has to go along with it. Before we go any further, I have to walk you through a small piece of bookkeeping, because if I do not, a number you might see somewhere else will not match the story I'm telling you, and I do not want you confused. For decades, the main tool scientists used to officially declare an El Niño or a La Niña was something called the Oceanic Niño Index. You can think of it as the thermometer hanging off the side of the Pacific. When that thermometer read warm enough for long enough, it was an El Niño. When it read cool enough for long enough, it was a La Niña. Simple, reliable, the standard for a generation. But there was a problem with that thermometer, and the problem was the dock it was hanging from. The entire ocean has been warming. Year after year, the background temperature of the whole Pacific has been creeping upward, and that meant the old El Niño threshold was getting easier and easier to cross, not because the El Niño signal itself was getting stronger, but simply because the water it was being measured against was warmer to begin with. Imagine trying to measure how high the tide comes in by marking the water level on a dock, while the dock itself is slowly sinking into the seabed. After a while, your measurements stop telling you about the tide. They start telling you about the dock. So in February of 2026, the Climate Prediction Center retired the old index and replaced it with a new one, called the Relative Oceanic Niño Index. The new tool does something the old one did not. It subtracts out the planet-wide ocean warming trend, so what is left is the El Niño signal itself, clean, separated from the warming it has been riding on top of. It is a better thermometer, mounted on a dock that does not sink. For our purposes today, the practical takeaway is this. The reason you might hear the El Niño described carefully in terms of a watch, and probabilities rather than as a single number that just flipped from negative to positive, is partly because the way it is officially measured changed 3 months ago. But the underlying physical truth has not changed at all. The equatorial Pacific has turned warm, the cool stretch is over, and the agencies are now describing that turn through a watch, because the watch is the honest way to describe a system standing on a doorstep. Now, here is where it gets genuinely interesting, because the surface of the ocean is only half the picture, and frankly it is the less important half. The real signal, the one the forecasters are actually leaning on, is happening underneath, out of sight. Below the waves. The Climate Prediction Center reported that the index measuring the temperature beneath the surface of the equatorial Pacific has now risen for 5 consecutive months. 5 months in a row of warming, down where you cannot see it, and the engine driving that is something with a wonderful name, a downwelling Kelvin wave. Let me explain what that is without the jargon, because it matters. Picture a slow, enormous pulse of warm water moving from west to east along the equator, but moving along beneath the surface rather than on top of it. It is like a swell travelling under a blanket. You cannot see the warm water itself, but it is there, sliding eastward, 100 to 250 meters down. And the water inside that pulse, right now, is running 6 to 7 degrees Celsius above normal. That is an enormous anomaly. That is not a nudge. That is a freight train of heat, moving toward the eastern Pacific, just below the line of sight. This is what forecasters mean when they say the fuel is already in the tank. An El Niño, at its core, is the ocean releasing a vast amount of stored heat into the atmosphere, and the heat that would drive a major event is right now, already loaded into the Pacific. It is already there. Multiple independent analyses have looked at the magnitude of that subsurface heat, and compared it to the great El Niño events of the modern record, and the comparison they keep landing on is unsettling. The amount of heat staged in the ocean right now is in the same class as the onset phases of 1997 and 2015. Those 2 years produced the 2 strongest El Niño events ever recorded. The fuel that drove them is the kind of fuel sitting in the Pacific today. So if the heat is loaded, why is this still only a watch? Why is the system on the doorstep instead of through it? And here I have to be completely honest with you, because the honest answer is also the interesting one. The missing piece is the atmosphere. An El Niño is not just warm water, it is a partnership. The ocean and the winds have to start working together, reinforcing each other in a feedback loop. Normally, trade winds blow across the tropical Pacific from east to west, piling warm water up on the western side. For a full El Niño to lock in, those trade winds have to slacken, and as they slacken, the warm water sloshes back east, and that warmth weakens the winds further, and the weaker winds let more warm water through, and around it goes, each step amplifying the next. That is called coupling. The ocean speaks, the atmosphere answers, and they escalate together. As of the middle of May, the ocean has spoken loudly with that freight train of subsurface heat, but the atmosphere has only partly answered. The coupling has not fully taken hold yet, and until it does, the system stays on the doorstep. It helps to understand the bigger rhythm this is part of, because El Niño is not a one-off event that appears from nowhere. It is one phase of a cycle, a slow oscillation that the tropical Pacific has been running for as far back as we can reconstruct. Scientists call the whole cycle ENSO, the El Niño Southern Oscillation, and it has 3 states. There is La Niña, the cool phase, when the trade winds blow strong and the warm water is piled hard against the western Pacific and the eastern side runs cold. There is the neutral state, the in-between, which is where we technically still are, and there is El Niño, the warm phase, when the winds slacken and the warmth floods east. The system breathes between these states, not on a clean schedule, but in a loose rhythm that tends to run somewhere between 2 and 7 years. What makes the current moment significant is not just that El Niño is coming, It is that the Pacific has spent an unusually long, sustained stretch in the cool, La Niña-leaning side of that cycle, and it is now swinging hard the other way. A long, cool phase followed by a sharp swing to warm. That is a pattern with history. And as you will see when we get to 1877, it is a pattern worth paying very close attention to. There is one more thing to understand about why the Eastern Pacific matters so much geographically. The stretch of ocean the forecasters watch most closely sits along the equator in the central and eastern Pacific, and the reason a temperature anomaly there has such outsized global consequences is that this is the part of the planet where the ocean and the atmosphere are most tightly coupled in the first place. The tropical Pacific is the largest single source region for the heat and moisture that drive global atmospheric circulation. It is, in a real sense, the planet's thermostat and its pump at the same time. So when that specific stretch of water warms by even a degree or two, it is not a local event, it is a change at the control panel. The rest of the atmosphere has to respond, because the atmosphere is downstream of that ocean. That is the physical reason a watch issued for a patch of equatorial Pacific is, correctly understood, a watch issued for the whole planet's weather. That is the genuine uncertainty in this forecast, and I'm not going to paper over it, because the channel does not do that. The heat is real, the watch is real, the 82% is real. But whether this becomes a modest El Niño or a monster depends on a conversation between the ocean and the sky that has only just begun. So the watch is issued, the ocean is loaded, the forecasters are leaning hard, and the obvious question, the one almost no coverage actually answers, is this. A watch for what exactly? What is it that we are being told to watch for? The reflexive answer is rain, or drought, or a wet winter, or a warm one. But that reflexive answer is not the thing that should have your attention. The thing that should have your attention has almost nothing to do with the weather outside your window, and everything to do with something most of us never think about at all until the year we are forced to. To understand what that is, we have to talk about how strong this thing might actually get, because the difference between a normal El Niño and a great one is not a difference of degree, it is a difference of kind. Part 2. How strong and why it matters. Which? There is a temptation when you look at an El Niño forecast to treat strength as a dial. A little more, a little less, a degree here, a degree there. As if the difference between a weak event and a strong one is just a matter of turning the volume up. I want to take that idea apart right now because it is wrong, and the wrongness of it is the whole reason this video exists. The difference between a normal El Niño and a super El Niño is not the difference between loud and louder. It is the difference between a regional weather pattern and a planetary one. It is a difference of kind, not degree. And the forecast for 2026 is sitting right on the fault line between the two. So let us look at what the forecast actually says. The Climate Prediction Center, in its mid-May assessment, put the odds of this event peaking at strong or very strong at roughly 2 in 3. 2 in 3. And within that, the odds of a true super El Niño, the kind defined by a temperature anomaly of 2 degrees Celsius or more in the key Pacific region, came in at roughly 1 in 3. 1 in 3 for a super event. And here is the detail that tells you which way the wind is blowing. That 1 in 3 figure had risen from roughly 1 in 4 just a month earlier. The odds of a monster are not holding steady, they're climbing. Then there is the European model, run by the European Centre for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts, which has been the most aggressive of the major forecasting systems. Its forecast, initialized at the start of May, had roughly half of its ensemble members exceeding 2.5 degrees Celsius above normal by October. Let me unpack what an ensemble is, because it matters. A modern forecast is not one prediction. It is dozens of predictions, run with slightly different starting conditions, and you look at the spread of where they land. For the European model, the individual members for September spanned a range from about 1.7 degrees to about 3.3 degrees above normal. The average of all those members pointed towards something close to 3 degrees by late 2026. And I need you to understand what a value near 3 degrees would mean. It would put this El Niño in the same conversation as the strongest events ever recorded. Not a strong El Niño, one of the strongest, period. The World Meteorological Organization, which blends together many models from many countries, had its multi-model average approaching 1.5 degrees by the middle of summer, with what it described as a near-unanimous upward trajectory. Different system, different method, same direction, up. It is worth slowing down on what those threshold numbers actually mean, because the categories are not arbitrary, and the gap between them is where the danger lives. Forecasters generally describe an El Niño as weak when the peak anomaly is somewhere around 0.5 degree to 1 degree above normal. Moderate runs from about 1 degree to 1.5, strong from about 1.5 to 2, and very strong or super is the tier above 2 degrees. The 1997 to 1998 event peaked above 2.5 degrees. The 2015 to 2016 event peaked in the same neighbourhood. Those are the reference monsters, the events people in the field still measure others against. And the 2026 forecast, with NOAA giving a 1 in 3 chance of clearing that 2 degree super threshold, and the European model's average pointing near 3 degrees, is not forecasting a weak event that might get interesting. It is forecasting an event whose most likely outcomes sit in the strong to very strong band, with a real and rising tail reaching into the territory of the worst events in the modern record. I want to give you one more piece of physical context, because it explains why the forecasters are taking the subsurface signal as seriously as they are. The reason that freight train of warm water beneath the Pacific matters so much is that surface warmth, on its own, is fragile. A patch of warm water at the surface can be mixed away by a stretch of strong winds, cooled by a few cloudy weeks, erased before it ever becomes an event. But heat stored 100 or 200 meters down is insulated. It is protected from the day-to-day weather. It sits there, banked, waiting, and it can really only go one direction, which is up and eastward, into the event. When forecasters see 5 straight months of that subsurface index rising, and water 6 to 7 degrees above normal stage below the surface, what they are seeing is not a fragile surface fluke. They are seeing a committed signal, a reservoir of heat that has already been deposited and now has to be spent. That is a large part of why the watch carries the probabilities it does. The ocean has, in a sense, already made much of its decision. What is still open is how violently it spends what it has banked. Now, I have to do something here that I think is important, because if I do not, you will go online after this video and you will see claims that do not match what I just told you, and I want you to be able to tell the difference. There is a wave of content circulating right now, on social media and on a certain tier of websites, claiming things like 100% certainty of a super El Niño, or all models in perfect unanimous agreement, or a guaranteed record-shattering event. I want to be very clear. That is not what NOAA says. That is not what the European Centre says. That is not what the World Meteorological Organization says. The European Centre, in its own public communications, has stated plainly that there is strong consensus that an El Niño will develop, but there is not unanimity that a high-intensity outcome is certain, and the spread between its own ensemble members means a precise peak value cannot be reliably given. The honest, defensible version of this forecast is not 100% anything. The honest version is this: a strong, and possibly record-breaking, El Niño is likely, peaking around the turn of the year, but the atmosphere has not locked in yet, and certainty is not on the table. And that brings me to the single most important caveat in this entire video, the one I need you to carry with you through everything that follows. Forecasters call it the spring predictability barrier. It is a well-documented, well-understood weakness in El Niño forecasting, and it works like this. Forecasts issued in the boreal spring, which is exactly where we are right now, have historically lower skill than forecasts issued later in the year. There is a real physical reason for it. In late spring, the coupling between the ocean and the atmosphere, the very partnership we talked about in the last part, temporarily weakens, and that makes the whole system harder to model and harder to predict. And the history is humbling. In 2014, the spring model output pointed clearly at a strong El Niño. It never fully developed. In 2017, the same thing. Spring forecasts leaned strong, and the event fizzled. So when I tell you the odds of a super El Niño are 1 in 3 and climbing, I'm also telling you that spring forecasts have been confidently wrong before, and a careful person holds that fact in the other hand. This is a serious forecast. It is not a sure thing. Both of those statements are true at once, and the channel is going to hold both of them the whole way through. I think it is worth being honest about why the spring barrier exists at all, because understanding it actually helps you read the forecast correctly rather than just discounting it. Remember the coupling, the feedback loop between the ocean and the winds. In the spring, that loop is at its weakest point in the annual cycle. The ocean and the atmosphere are, in a sense, only loosely holding hands, and when the coupling is loose, the system is more sensitive to small, essentially random fluctuations in the winds. A model in spring can see the subsurface heat clearly, it can see the fuel, but it cannot reliably see whether the atmosphere is going to grab that fuel and run with it, or whether a few weeks of uncooperative winds will let the signal leak away. That is what happened in 2014. The fuel was there, the atmosphere never fully committed. By contrast, a forecast issued in, say, August, is issued at a point where the coupling has tightened and the system has shown its hand. So the right way to hold the 2026 forecast is not as a prediction you can bank, and not as noise you can dismiss. It is a serious, heavily leaning signal, issued at the one time of year when even serious signals carry an honest asterisk. The asterisk does not erase the signal, it just tells you to keep watching, because the real confirmation comes later in the summer, when the atmosphere finally answers. But here is why the strength tier matters so much for the story I'm telling you, and why I will not let it just be a number on a chart. A weak El Niño is a regional event. It nudges a few weather patterns. It might tip a winter slightly wetter in the southern United States, slightly drier somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. It is the kind of thing that matters to a ski resort or a reservoir manager, and not much beyond that. A super El Niño is a different animal entirely. A super El Niño does not nudge a region. It reaches across the entire Pacific Basin, an expanse of ocean spanning roughly a third of the planet's circumference, and it pulls. It pulls on the atmosphere over continents in all four corners of that basin at the same time. It reorganizes the jet stream. It moves the monsoon. It shifts where rain falls and where it does not in one country, but across Asia, Australia, the Americas and Africa, simultaneously, on the same signal. The strength is not a detail. The strength is the entire question of whether this is a weather event you will read about, or a planetary event that touches the price of food on every continent at once. And to understand what a super El Niño actually does when it reaches that planetary scale, to understand the implication that almost no one is talking about, we cannot stay in 2026. We have to go back. We have to go back to the last time the Pacific assembled this exact configuration at full strength and look honestly at what happened. Because it has happened, it is documented, it is studied, and it is the single most important piece of evidence for understanding the watch that was issued this week. We have to go back to a year the modern food system would very much prefer to forget. We have to go back to 1877. Part 3, 1877, the drought that crossed oceans. I want to tell you about a year, and I want you to hold the human scale of it in your mind, because the rest of this video depends on you feeling the weight of it, not just hearing the number. The year is 1877, though the event itself stretched from 1876 into 1878, and it has a name. Historians call it the Great Drought, or the Global Famine, and the death toll, the figure that comes not from folklore or exaggeration, but directly from peer-reviewed climate science, published in a major scientific journal, is an estimated 50 million people or more. 50 million! Let that sit for a second. That is not a regional tragedy. That is a number on the scale of the deadliest events in all of human history. And most people watching this have never heard of it. That last part is worth pausing on, because the obscurity of this event is itself part of the story. We remember the wars of the 19th century. We remember the named disasters. But the Great Drought, an event that killed on the scale of the largest catastrophes humanity has ever recorded, sits almost entirely outside public memory. Part of that is because it happened in places the dominant histories paid less attention to. Part of it is because famine, unlike war, has no single dramatic moment, no battle, no date, just a slow, grinding, distributed dying across continents. But whatever the reason, the result is that the single best real-world demonstration of what a super El Niño can do to the human food supply is also one of the least known. We are, in a sense, walking toward a forecast with the most relevant page of the manual already torn out of the book. Let me take you through where those deaths happened, because the geography is the entire point. In India, what became known as the Great Famine of 1876 to 1878 tore through the south and the centre of the country, centred on the regions around Madras, Bombay, Mysore and Hyderabad. The death toll there, depending on which careful estimate you use, runs somewhere between 5.5 million and 10 million people. In northern China, in the same window, there was a famine so severe that the people who lived through it called it the Incredible Famine, because the scale of it was beyond what they had words for. It struck the provinces of Shaanxi, Henan, Shandong, Shanxi and Zhili, and the estimated death toll there runs from 9.5 million to 13 million. And in the northeast of Brazil, in a catastrophe Brazilians still call the Grande Seca, the Great Drought, roughly 2 million people died, with the state of Ceará all but destroyed. And it did not stop there. In the same span of months, drought and famine struck Ethiopia, Sudan, Egypt, Korea, Vietnam, the Philippines, the island of Java, parts of southern Africa, Morocco. Pull back far enough, and you are not looking at a list of separate national disasters. You are looking at a single thing. You are looking at a planet where the rains failed almost everywhere that mattered, all at once. And that is the detail I need you to lock onto, because it is the hinge of this entire video. The horror of 1877 was not the severity of any one drought. India had suffered terrible droughts before, so had China, so had Brazil. Drought on its own was not new. What was new, what was almost unimaginable, was the synchrony. The monsoon failed across multiple continents in the same window of time. The breadbaskets of the world did not take turns failing. They failed together. And I want to say this plainly, because it is the sentence the whole video is built around. That exact thing, the simultaneous failure of agriculture across continents, is the thing the modern food system is not built to survive. Sit with the structure of that for a moment, because it is the difference between a hard year and a catastrophe, and it is easy to miss. A normal famine, however terrible, has a geography. It has an edge. The drought ends somewhere, and on the other side of that edge there is a region having an ordinary year, or even a good one. With grain, it can move toward the hunger. The whole human response to famine, for as long as there has been trade, has depended on that edge existing. You carry food from the place that has it to the place that does not. But in 1877 there was no edge, or the edge had been pushed so far out that it stopped functioning. When the monsoon fails in India and in China, and the rains fail in Brazil all in the same season, there is no neighbour with a surplus to carry. There is no other side. The whole planet is the inside of the famine at once. That is what synchrony does. It does not just add up the regional disasters, it removes the thing that has always been used to survive them, and the timing made it worse in a way that is almost too neat to be real. The 19th century was the exact period when the world's food markets were being stitched together for the first time by railroads and steamships and the telegraph. For the first time in history, the price of grain in one country was tightly linked to the price of grain everywhere. The promise of that integration was resilience, the idea that a connected market could always route food from surplus to shortage. The reality, when 1877 hit, was the opposite. A connected market with no surplus anywhere does not route food. It routes the shortage. It transmits the failure outward instead of absorbing it. 1877 was, in a sense, the first stress test of a globalized food system, and the system did not pass. Now there is a second layer to the story of 1877, and I have to handle it carefully and honestly, because it is important and it is also contested. In 2001, the historian Mike Davis published a book called Late Victorian Holocausts, and it remains the definitive popular account of these famines. Davis's argument was that the drought was the trigger, the physical cause, the thing that made the crops fail. But the mass death, he argued, the sheer scale of the mortality, was not made by the weather alone. It was amplified by policy, by the economic ideology of the colonial powers that governed many of the affected regions. He documented grain being exported out of famine zones, even as the people who grew it starved. India continued shipping wheat to Britain through the worst of it. He documented railroads, the great modern marvel of the age, being used to move grain to ports for export rather than inland to the hungry. He documented relief that was withheld, or made conditional on punishing physical labour that the starving could not survive. I want to be precise about how to hold this. The climate science of 1877, the part about the ocean and the drought, is settled. We will get to exactly how settled in the next part, and it is remarkable. Davis's argument about policy, about colonial governance turning a drought into a catastrophe of this magnitude, is influential, it is serious, and it is also debated among economic historians. It is an interpretation. So when this video talks about 1877, understand the split. The climate trigger is established fact. The policy amplification is Davis's argument, and a contested one. Both are part of the story, but they are not the same kind of claim. But I do not want to wave past Davis's point too quickly, because even in its contested form, it carries a lesson that matters directly for 2026. The lesson is this: the drought sets the upper bound of the disaster. The human response decides where, within that bound, the disaster actually lands. A drought of a given severity can produce a hard year, or it can produce a mass casualty event, and the difference between those two outcomes is not written in the rainfall. It is written in the decisions. Whether grain is hoarded or moved, whether relief arrives or is withheld, whether the most exposed populations are protected or abandoned to a market. Davis's specific argument about colonial ideology is debated, but the underlying structural point, that the responses are variable and not a constant, is not really in dispute, and that is the part that should travel forward with us. Because when we get to the end of this video and talk about why 2026 is unlikely to repeat 1877's death toll, the entire reason is that the response variable is different now. We have early warning, we have relief infrastructure, we do not have the same forced market integration under colonial rule. The drought mechanism can reassemble, the response does not have to. One more piece of bookkeeping, because numbers around this event get muddled, and I do not want you to be the one who is confused. You will sometimes see the death toll of these famines cited as 30 to 60 million. That wider figure is Davis's aggregate, and it covers 3 separate famine episodes, not one. It includes 1876 to 1878, but also a second episode in the 1890s, and a third around the turn of the century. For the specific event we are talking about, the 1876 to 1878 Great Drought, the figure from the peer-reviewed climate science is the one to hold, exceeding 50 million people. So why am I telling you all of this? Why spend these minutes in the 19th century when the video is about a watch issued this week? Because 1877 is not a history lesson. I need you to hear that clearly. 1877 is the evidence. It is the only full-strength, real-world demonstration we have of the exact mechanism we are about to examine. Everything in that terrible year, the synchrony, the crossing of oceans, the simultaneous failure, points forward to a single question. The machinery that did this, the physical machinery in the ocean and the atmosphere, can it switch on again? And to answer that, we have to understand what that machinery actually was. Because for more than a century, 1877 was treated as a string of unrelated regional disasters. And then, in 2018, a team of scientists proved that it was one event. Part 4, the triple whammy, why? 1877 synchronized. For over 100 years, the famines of 1877 sat in the history books as separate entries. The Indian famine in one chapter, the Chinese famine in another, the Brazilian drought somewhere else entirely. Each one studied on its own terms, each one explained by its own local circumstances. The idea that they were a single, connected, physically linked event was not really on the table, because no one had assembled the evidence to put it there. Then, in 2018, a paper was published in the Journal of Climate, titled simply Climate and the Global Famine of 1876 to 78. The authors were a team of climate scientists Singh, Seeger, Cook, Kane, Ting, Cook and Davis. And I want to point out one name on that author list because it is unusual, and it tells you something. Davis, Mike Davis, the historian who wrote Late Victorian Holocausts. He was a co-author on a hard climate science paper, History and Physics, working the same problem in the same study. That does not happen often, and it happened here because the question demanded both. What the team did was bring together every line of evidence available, direct observations from the period, paleoclimate reconstructions, the long records pulled from things like tree rings that let you reach back centuries before instruments existed, and climate model simulations run to test whether the physical story held together. They set all of it against roughly 140 years of instrumental data and against an 800-year tree ring drought record. And what they found was that the Great Drought was not a coincidence of separate events. It was produced by an extraordinary, possibly unique combination of 3 ocean conditions, all happening at the same time. The team's own framing, and the one I will use, is the triple whammy. Here is the first part of the whammy, a record-breaking El Niño in the tropical Pacific. the same phenomenon we have been talking about this whole video, and there is a detail here that should make the hair on your arm stand up, given where we are in 2026. That 1877 El Niño was likely primed, made more explosive, by a preceding stretch of cool, La Niña-like conditions in the years just before it. The Pacific went cool, and then it went violently warm. That El Niño was the engine that drove the core droughts across what scientists call monsoon Asia, the vast swath of the continent whose agriculture lives and dies by the seasonal monsoon rains. Here is the second part, an extreme positive phase of something called the Indian Ocean Dipole. Let me explain that simply because it comes back later. The Indian Ocean Dipole is a temperature seesaw. It describes the difference in sea surface temperature between the western side of the Indian Ocean and the eastern side. When it tips strongly into its positive phase, it rearranges where rain falls across the whole Indian Ocean region. And in 1877, the study found that seesaw tipped harder than it has at any other time in the record, before or since. The strongest positive Indian Ocean dipole ever documented. It intensified and prolonged the drought across Australia, and it worked together with the El Niño to deepen the disaster across Asia. And here is the third part, a record warm North Atlantic. On the other side of the planet, the North Atlantic Ocean in 1877 was the warmest it had been in records reaching back to the 1850s. And that warmth did its own damage. It pushed the moisture-bearing winds that would normally carry rain to northeastern Brazil northward, away from where they were needed, and it extended drought into northern and southeastern Africa. 3 oceans. 3 separate, simultaneous record or near-record conditions. The Pacific, the Indian, and the Atlantic, all pulling in the same catastrophic direction at the same moment. That is the triple whammy. And the headline finding of the study, the single sentence that should stay with you, is this. According to that 800-year paleoclimate reconstruction, monsoon Asia in 1877 experienced the single most intense and the second most expansive drought of the last 800 years. Not the worst in living memory, the worst, on one measure, in 8 centuries. I want to dwell on what it means that scientists can even say that, because the 800-year figure is not a guess and it is not a flourish. It comes from something called a drought atlas, and the way it is built is genuinely remarkable. Trees, in the regions that have them, lay down a ring every year, and the width and density of that ring records how wet or dry that year was. Wet years leave fat rings, dry years leave thin ones. Gather enough trees, old enough trees, across a wide enough area, and you can reconstruct year by year, century by century, how drought moved across a continent long before any human being was writing down a rainfall measurement. When the team behind the 2018 study set 1877 against that 800-year tree ring record for monsoon Asia, they were not comparing it to living memory, or to the period of instruments, or even to the colonial archives. They were comparing it against 8 centuries of the land's own record of itself. And in 800 years of that record, 1877 stands at the top for intensity. That is the scientific weight behind the word catastrophe. There is also a piece of the physics worth making explicit, because it is the thing that makes the triple whammy more than just 3 bad rolls of the dice landing together. The reason 3 simultaneous ocean anomalies are so much worse than the sum of 3 separate ones is that they were not independent in their effects. They reinforced each other. The Pacific El Niño was suppressing the monsoon over Asia. The extreme Indian Ocean dipole was, at the same time, doing its own independent damage to the rainfall patterns over the same broad region and over Australia. The two were not just adding their droughts together side by side. They were stacking in the same places, deepening each other's reach, and the warm North Atlantic was pulling moisture away from a third continent entirely. So the triple whammy was not 3 regional famines that happened to coincide. It was a single planet-scale rearrangement of where rain was allowed to fall, driven by 3 oceans that all happened to be in an extreme state at once. That is the machine, and that is why understanding whether the machine can reassemble is not an academic question. It is the only question that matters. The lead author of that study, Deepti Singh, said something about the work that I think is the most important quote in this entire video, and I want to give it to you as close to her own framing as I can. She said the study showed that the stage was set for a reprise of the worst-known drought and famine. Not that it would happen, not a prediction of doom, but that the configuration that caused it, the arrangement of the oceans that drove 1877, is not some impossible vanished thing. It is a physically possible state. It is a configuration the climate system can re-enter. The stage, she said, is set. So here is where this lands, and here is the bridge back to everything else. The triple whammy is the proof. It is the proof that the synchrony of 1877 was not bad luck, not a grim coincidence, not a string of unrelated disasters that happened to overlap. It was a physical mechanism, a real, identifiable, documented arrangement of the oceans that synchronized crop failure across continents. And the moment you know that, the moment you know it was a mechanism and not an accident, you are forced to ask the only question that matters. The ingredients of that configuration, the record warm oceans, the El Niño, the Indian Ocean dipole, where do they stand in 2026? Let me start that accounting now, even though we will come back to it in full, because the early answer is uncomfortable. Ingredient 1, a record-breaking El Niño primed by a preceding cool stretch. We have a developing El Niño under an official watch, with subsurface heat in the class of the strongest events on record, and it is emerging right out of a long La Niña-leaning cool stretch. That is not a loose resemblance to the 1877 setup. That is the same opening move. Ingredient 3, a record-warm North Atlantic and record-warm oceans broadly. We will see in a later part that 2026 is running at or near record ocean temperatures across the board. That ingredient is, broadly speaking, already present. Ingredient 2, the extreme positive Indian Ocean dipole, is the genuine wildcard, and I will give it the honest treatment it deserves when we get there, because in 2026 it might cut the other way. But notice what we are looking at. 2 of the 3 ingredients of the configuration that the attribution scientists called possibly unique are not hypothetical for 2026. They're either here or developing. The machine's parts are on the table, because if 1877 was the machine running at full power, then the next thing we have to do is open up that machine and understand exactly how it reaches across an ocean and makes the harvest fail together. And what that machine threatens is something the modern world has quietly bet against without ever admitting it placed the bet. Part 5. The assumption. Underneath everything. I am going to state the core of this video as plainly as I can, in one sentence, and then I am going to spend the rest of this part proving it to you. Here it is. The global food system is built on a hidden assumption, and that assumption is wrong. Let me tell you what the assumption is, because you have almost certainly never thought about it, and that is precisely the point. It is invisible. The assumption is independence. It is the quiet, unspoken belief that a bad harvest in the United States, a bad harvest in India, a bad harvest in Australia, and a bad harvest in Brazil are unrelated events. That each one is its own roll of the dice. That when the wheat fails in Kansas, that tells you nothing at all, about what the rice is doing in India or what the wheat is doing in Australia. Each breadbasket in this picture is a separate gambler at a separate table, and the house assumes their luck does not correlate. And this assumption is not just a vague cultural belief, it is structural, it is load-bearing. Crop insurance is priced on it, because if breadbaskets fail together, the insurers could not cover the losses, so the math quietly assumes they do not. National grain reserves are sized on it, because a country only needs to stockpile enough to bridge its own bad year, on the assumption it can always buy from someone else having a good one. International trade models lean on it. The entire architecture of global food security, the buffers, the reserves, the trade flows, the insurance, is built on top of the belief that the world's breadbaskets roll their dice separately. In 2019, a study published in the journal Science Advances took that assumption and broke it. The paper was by Anderson, Seeger, Bethgen, Kane, and Yu, and it was titled Synchronous Crop Failures and Climate-Forced Production Variability. And what the researchers did was elegant. They asked a direct question: are there forces in the climate system that can make distant breadbaskets fail at the same time? And if so, which ones? They tested 4 of the major climate modes, the big recurring patterns that move weather around the planet. They tested El Niño and the Southern Oscillation. They tested the Indian Ocean dipole, that temperature seesaw we talked about. They tested something called tropical Atlantic variability. And they tested the North Atlantic Oscillation. 4 candidates, 4 forces that could, in principle, link harvests across the globe. And here is what they found. All four of those modes affect crop production variability to some degree, but only one of them, only one, can force globally synchronous crop failure. Only one of them can reach across the entire planet and pull the breadbaskets down together, and that one is El Niño. Think about why that single result is so important. The other three modes are real, and they matter. The Indian Ocean. Dipole shapes harvests around the Indian Ocean. Tropical Atlantic variability shapes them around the Atlantic. The North Atlantic Oscillation pushes European and North American weather around. But each of those is in the end regional. Each one has a footprint, and the footprint, however large, has edges. They can hurt a region, even a few regions, but they cannot reach all the way around the planet at once. El Niño can. El Niño is the only one of the four that operates at the scale the global food system actually trades at. So when you ask the question, is there a single force that can override the independence of the world's breadbaskets? The honest scientific answer is not a vague maybe. It is a specific name, and the name is El Niño, and the study tested the obvious alternatives precisely so it could rule them out. Let me give you the numbers, because the numbers make it concrete. The study found that El Niño in the Southern Oscillation accounts for roughly 18% of the year-to-year variability in globally aggregated maize production. 18% of the swing in the entire planet's corn harvest, traceable to one ocean pattern. For wheat, the figure was around 7%. For soybean, around 6%. And the researchers identified the single largest synchronous crop failure in the entire modern historical record. It was the El Niño of 1983. But the numbers are not even the most important part. The most important part is a single sentence from the paper itself, and I want to quote it as directly as I can, because it is the sentence this whole video orbits. The researchers wrote that their finding runs counter to a central pillar of the global agriculture system, a pillar that assumes that crop failures in geographically distant breadbasket regions, such as the United States, China, and Argentina, are unrelated. A central pillar. That is the language the scientists themselves used, not a minor assumption. A central pillar, and El Niño is the force that knocks it down. I want to make this concrete, because the independence assumption can sound abstract and it is anything but. Think about how an insurance company can afford to insure crops at all. It works because of diversification, the same principle that lets an insurer cover thousands of houses against fire. Not every house burns down in the same year. The risks are spread out, mostly independent, so the premiums from the many cover the losses of the few. Crop insurance, scaled up to the global level, works the same way. The whole financial structure assumes that a drought in one breadbasket and a drought in another are roughly independent events, so the system can spread the risk and stay solvent. Now ask what happens if that assumption is wrong. If the breadbaskets can fail together on a single signal, then the diversification is an illusion. The risks are correlated, and a financial structure built on diversification facing correlated risk is a structure facing a loss it did not price for. The same logic runs through national grain reserves, which are sized on the assumption that a country can buy its way out of a bad year because someone else is having a good one. It runs through the trade models that governments use to plan. The independence assumption is not a footnote in the global food system, it is load-bearing, and the science says the load it is bearing can be lifted off it by a single, warm patch of Pacific water. Now, you might reasonably ask, how? How does a warm patch of water in the Pacific Ocean reach all the way around the planet and pull on harvests in places thousands of miles from the equator and thousands of miles from each other? And the answer comes from the companion paper by the same core team, Anderson and colleagues, published in 2018 in the journal Agricultural and Forest Meteorology. They traced the mechanism, and what they found is that most of El Niño's effects on the world's crops trace back to a single, large atmospheric circulation pattern. One pattern. It develops in the late summer, it strengthens, and it persists through into the following spring, and while it persists, it touches the climate on continents in all four corners of the Pacific Basin at once. Think about what that means physically. It is not four separate coincidental disruptions. It is one disturbance in the atmosphere set off by the warm ocean that happens to have its fingers in four places simultaneously. Picture one hand resting on a console of levers, and when that hand pushes down, four levers move together because they are connected to the same hand. That is the mechanism. One trans-Pacific circulation pattern, four corners of an ocean, harvests rising and falling together because they are wired to the same switch. The same study estimated that El Niño accounts for something like 57% of the variability in wheat yields across North and South America combined. More than half the swing in the wheat harvest of 2 entire continents traceable to that one pattern, and there is a second pathway, separate from the first and just as unsettling. This one runs through the jet stream itself. In 2020, a study by Kornhuber and colleagues in the journal Nature Climate Change looked at what happens when the jet stream, the great river of fast-moving air that circles the northern hemisphere, develops large, slow, stationary meanders. Scientists call these amplified Rossby waves. When the jet stream stops flowing in a relatively straight line and instead locks into a big frozen wavy pattern, that pattern parks heat and drought over specific regions, and crucially it parks them over specific linked sets of regions, the same regions, at the same time. The study found that when those amplified wave patterns dominate, the probability of simultaneous heat extremes hitting those linked breadbasket regions rises by up to a factor of 20 times more likely that the heat hits them together. And then there is a follow-up by the same lead researcher, Kornhuber, published in 2023 in Nature Communications, and this one I need you to really hear, because it inverts something most people assume. The follow-up found that the climate and crop models we rely on do reproduce these jet stream wave patterns reasonably well, but they underestimate the surface damage. They underestimate how badly the crops actually respond. In other words, the official projections, the ones that inform government planning and market forecasting, are not alarmist. If anything, they are the opposite. They underwarn. The real risk of synchronized failure sits wider, on the bad side, than the published numbers show. I want to make sure that last point lands, because it cuts against an instinct most of us carry. When we hear that a model is warning about something, the reflex is to assume the model is being cautious, conservative, maybe even overcautious, padding the bad case to be safe. The Kornhuber follow-up says the reverse is happening here. The models capture the atmospheric machinery, the wavy-locked jet stream, well enough. Where they fall short is in translating that machinery into actual lost bushels in actual fields. The crops, in the real world, respond worse than the models predict. So the picture you get from the official synchronized failure projections is not the worst case dressed up to scare you. It is closer to a best case, an underestimate, with the genuine risk sitting somewhere out past the edge of the published numbers. That is an uncomfortable thing to know, and it is exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to tell you plainly. The danger here is not that the warnings are too loud. It is that the warnings, by the science's own admission, are too quiet. And there is one more strand worth putting on the table, because it is the third independent line of evidence pointing the same way. A separate study, by Gaup and colleagues, also published in 2020 in Nature Climate Change, took decades of actual production data and climate extreme data for the major breadbaskets and asked a blunt question. Is the risk of simultaneous failure of wheat, maize and soybean across breadbaskets going up over time? And the answer they found was yes. The risk of synchronous low-yield events across the world's breadbaskets is rising, and it is higher than a model built on the independence assumption would predict. So now you have 3 separate research efforts, using 3 different methods, all converging on the same uncomfortable conclusion. Anderson and colleagues, identifying El Niño as the one force that can synchronize failure. Kornhuber and colleagues, finding that the models underestimate how bad that synchronization gets. And Gaup and colleagues, finding that the synchronized risk is climbing. 3 teams, 3 methods, 1 direction. So put it all together. There is one force, El Niño, that the science has now clearly shown can override the independence the entire food system assumes between distant breadbaskets. It does it through a single trans-Pacific circulation pattern that touches 4 corners of an ocean at once. And it does it through a jet stream that can lock into wave patterns that park drought on linked regions together. The pillar the food system rests on, the assumption that the breadbaskets roll their dice separately, is not a law of nature, it is a convenient belief, and the science says El Niño does not respect it. Which leads exactly to the next question, the unavoidable one. If El Niño is the force that can knock the breadbaskets down together, then which breadbaskets does it knock down? And just as importantly, is there anything left standing, anything at all to catch the world when it does? Part 6. Winners, losers, and the cushion that might not hold. I need to correct a picture that might be forming in your head, because the truth is more specific, and the specificity is where the danger actually lives. El Niño is not a blanket. It does not settle over the planet and make every harvest everywhere fail. That is not how it works. El Niño does something more surgical and, in a way, more dangerous than that. It makes a specific map of harvests fail, and it leaves others alone, and sometimes it even helps a few. The danger is not universal ruin. The danger is the shape of the map. The foundational work on this comes from a study by Izumi and colleagues, published in 2014 in Nature Communications, which looked at how El Niño affects the global yields of the major crops. The 4 crops that together supply roughly 60% of all the calories humanity grows on cropland. And what they found was a patchwork. Start with the one piece of relatively good news because it matters later: soybean. Under El Niño, soybean is the consistent winner. Global average soybean yield tends to improve by something in the range of 2 to 5%, and the reason is geographic. El Niño conditions tend to favour the major soybean growing belts of the United States and South America, so soybean, on the whole, comes out ahead. Now the rest: maize, rice, and wheat. Under El Niño, these 3 fare worse. The global average yield change for them lands somewhere in the range of negative 4.3% to positive 0.8%. And I want to be honest about what that range means, because intellectual honesty is the whole job here. That range straddles 0. It is neutral to negative. Maize and rice generally take a hit, but the global average effect is frankly modest. It is not a collapse. If you only looked at the global average, you might even shrug, and that is exactly the trap. Because the global average is the wrong thing to look at. I will say that again because it is the key to this entire part. The danger of El Niño is not in the average. The danger is in the correlation structure. The danger is in who fails together. So let me show you the map. Let me show you who loses. Under El Niño, the regions that tend to take the damage are India and Southeast Asia, where the rice and wheat harvests suffer as the monsoon weakens. Australia, where the wheat belt dries out. Northern China, where maize and wheat are hit. The Brazilian Cerrado and the Brazilian Northeast. And Southern Africa, where the maize crop, the staple that feeds the region, comes under pressure. That is the loss map, and I want you to notice something about it. Look at those names again: India, China, Australia, Brazil, Southern Africa. Those are not minor agricultural players. Those are major exporters and major populations, and in the case of India and Southeast Asia, the largest rice-consuming populations on the planet. And I want to slow down on why the loss map is the loss map, because it is not random. There is a physical logic to which regions El Niño tends to dry out, and the logic is the monsoon. A huge fraction of the people on Earth, and a huge fraction of the food those people eat, depend on monsoon rainfall, the seasonal reversal of winds that, in a normal year, hauls moisture off the ocean and dumps it over the land in a reliable wet season. The Indian monsoon, the Southeast Asian monsoon, the rainfall systems that feed northern Australia and parts of southern Africa. What El Niño does, through that single trans-Pacific circulation pattern we talked about, is interfere with those monsoons. It weakens them. It makes them arrive late, or leave early, or simply deliver less. So the loss map is really a monsoon map. It is the map of the agricultural regions whose entire growing calendar is built around rains that El Niño is known to suppress. That is why the same names keep appearing. They are not unlucky. They are physically wired to the part of the system El Niño disrupts most directly, and there is a calorie dimension here that makes it heavier still. The crops on that loss map, rice and wheat especially, are not specialty crops or animal feed or industrial inputs. They are the direct, primary, on-the-plate calories for billions of people. Rice alone is the staple food for more than half the human population, and the overwhelming majority of the world's rice is grown and eaten in exactly the monsoon-dependent regions that sit on the El Niño loss map. So when you look at that map, you're not looking at an abstract chart of production statistics. You're looking at the calorie supply for the largest concentrations of people on the planet, all of it wired to the same monsoon, and the monsoon wired to the same Pacific. And now look at who wins. The winner map under El Niño is essentially 2 regions: the United States Midwest and southeastern South America, meaning Argentina and southern Brazil, for maize and soybean. That is the cushion. That is the buffer. When El Niño pulls the loss map regions down, the system's quiet expectation is that the United States and Argentina will be having a good year, producing a surplus, and that surplus flows out into the world and catches the countries that are short. That is the mechanism by which the independence assumption is supposed to save us even when it is being violated. Some fail, some win, the winners cover the losers, the system holds. Now hold that loss map next to the triple whammy of 1877. A super El Nino on the 1877 pattern strikes India, China, Australia, the Brazilian Cerrado, and Southern Africa at the same time on the same signal. Multiple major exporters, the world's largest rice consumers, all pulled down together in the same growing season. That is not a hypothetical. That is the loss map and the 1877 pattern describing the same set of countries. So everything comes down to the cushion. It comes down to whether the United States and Argentina hold. And here is the uncomfortable truth. The science says those regions tend to win under El Nino. Tend to. But tend to is not the same as always. A tendency is a statistical lean, not a guarantee. There is no law that says the United States Midwest must have a good year just because the Pacific is warm. And so the genuinely frightening scenario, the one that should keep a food security planner awake, is not the one where El Nino hurts everyone. It is the narrower, sharper one. It is the scenario where El Nino hurts all the usual losers, exactly as the 1877 pattern predicts, and at the same time, for reasons of its own, the usual winner has an off year. The cushion fails to inflate. The surplus that is supposed to flow out and catch the world simply is not there. That is the scenario. The losers lose and the catcher drops the catch. And I want you to notice how thin the margin in that scenario actually is, because it is thinner than it sounds. The cushion is not the whole world. It is essentially two regions, the United States Midwest and Southeast and South America. That is it. The entire structure that is supposed to absorb a synchronized El Nino shock to the loss map breadbaskets rests on two parts of two continents having a good year at the same time, two regions carrying the catch for the planet. And those two regions are subject to their own weather, their own droughts, their own heat domes, their own bad luck, none of which is bound by what El Nino does. The system is not asking for a miracle. It is just quietly assuming that the two specific places it depends on will not have an off year in the one year it most needs them not to. Most years, that assumption is fine. The danger is that it only has to be wrong once, in the wrong year, for the consequences to be severe. There is also a subtle trap in the soybean good news, and it is worth naming so you do not overcomfort yourself with it. Yes, soybean tends to do better under El Nino, but you cannot eat your way out of a rice and wheat shortage with soybeans. The crops do not substitute cleanly. They feed different populations in different forms through different supply chains. A region that depends on rice as its direct staple does not get rescued by a good soybean year in Argentina. So the fact that one of the four major crops tends to come out ahead under El Nino is real, but it is not the buffer it might look like at a glance. The buffer that actually matters for the loss map regions is a good wheat and maize year in the winner regions, and that is the thing that is not guaranteed. There is one more piece I have to put on the table here, because it is the single biggest source of uncertainty in whether this whole mechanism even fully expresses itself in 2026, and it is a familiar character. It is the Indian Ocean dipole. Remember, in 1877, that temperature seesaw across the Indian Ocean tipped into the strongest positive phase ever recorded, and that deepened the catastrophe. It made everything worse. But here is the strange inversion for 2026. The forecasters are watching the Indian Ocean dipole closely, and there is a scenario where a positive dipole turning on in the late summer could actually partially offset the second half of the Indian monsoon. The same ocean feature that deepened the disaster in 1877 is now being watched as a possible break. It is a genuinely open question, and it is one of the main reasons no one can tell you with certainty how hard the mechanism will bite this time. I am not going to pretend that uncertainty away. It is real, and it cuts both ways. And I want to sit with that inversion for a moment, because it is genuinely strange, and it is a good illustration of why this is hard. The exact same physical feature, a positive Indian Ocean dipole, was a villain in 1877 and could be a partial rescuer in 2026. How can that be? It is because the effect of the dipole depends on the rest of the configuration it is embedded in, and on the timing relative to the monsoon's own calendar. In 1877 it tipped extreme, and it stacked onto an El Nino in a way that compounded the drought. In 2026, the way the India Meteorological Department is reading it. A positive dipole arriving at a certain point in the late summer could push some moisture back toward India during the second half of the monsoon season, partly counteracting the El Niño's suppression. Same feature, opposite role, because the surrounding system and the timing are different. This is the honest texture of climate prediction. It is not a set of fixed levers that always pull the same direction. It is a set of interacting pieces whose combined effect depends on how they line up. And that is precisely why I keep telling you, the uncertainty is about magnitude and timing, not mechanism. The mechanism, the capacity of El Niño to synchronize, is solid. Exactly how hard it bites in this particular year, with this particular dipole behavior, is genuinely not knowable yet. But the map itself, the loss map, does not depend on the dipole. The map tells you where the mechanism can strike, and it tells you the strike zone is several of the world's most important breadbaskets at once. The next question is the one that turns this from a story about physics into a story about right now. What condition are those breadbaskets actually in? Today, in the middle of May 2026, before the El Niño has even officially arrived? Because if they were strong, if they were buffered, if the granaries were full, then maybe the mechanism would have to fight its way through a healthy system. And if they are not, then the mechanism is being handed an open door. Part 7. The system is already bleeding. Here is the thing I keep coming back to. The thing that turns this from an interesting piece of climate history into something with genuine teeth. A strong El Niño in 2026 is not going to arrive onto a healthy, well-buffered, well-fed global food system. It is going to arrive onto a system that, in several of its most important regions, is already bleeding before the first cut. Start with the United States, with that cushion we just talked about, the buffer the whole world quietly depends on. As of late April 2026, the United States winter wheat crop was in trouble. The share of the crop rated good to excellent had fallen to roughly 30%. To give you a sense of how bad that is, a year earlier that same figure had been somewhere around 45 to 48%. So the crop went into this spring rated dramatically worse than it was rated the spring before. Drought covered roughly 69% of the United States winter wheat growing area. More than 95% of the southern plains, the heart of the American hard red winter wheat country, was in drought or abnormal dryness. In Oklahoma, 54% of the wheat was rated poor or very poor. In Texas, 51%. In Colorado, 49%. And when the United States Department of Agriculture put out its May 2026 supply and demand estimates, it forecast winter wheat production down 25% from the year before, a quarter of the crop gone compared to last year. I covered the broader picture of this in a video earlier this month, the one on the worst drought in the United States instrumental record, and I would point you back to that if you want the full depth of how dry the country has gotten. But for today, the point is narrower and sharper. The cushion is already compromised. The region the world counts on to produce a surplus when El Niño pulls the other breadbaskets down is itself walking into the event with a drought-hit wheat crop. And it is not just the United States. Look at the global grain stocks, the reserves, the buffer the whole system keeps in the warehouse. They are tightening. The May 2026 estimates put global wheat production at around 819 million tonnes. The year before, the world had produced a record, around 844 million tonnes. So global wheat production is forecast to fall from a record high. United States wheat ending stocks, the amount left in the bin at the end of the marketing year, were projected to come in around 18% below the prior year. And global corn ending stocks were projected at their lowest level since the 2013 to 2014 marketing year. Think about what that means. The world's pantry, for two of its most important staple grains, is being drawn down at exactly the moment the one force that can synchronize crop failure is being forecast to switch on. I want to make sure the idea of grain stocks is concrete for you, because it is the single most important buffer in this whole story, and most people never think about it. Ending stocks are, very simply, the grain left over at the end of a marketing year, the carryover, the cushion between one harvest and the next. They are the reason a single bad harvest does not immediately become a crisis. If the world goes into a bad year with full bins, the carryover absorbs the shock, prices stay relatively stable, and the system rides it out. If the world goes into a bad year with thin bins, there is nothing to absorb the shock, and a yield shortfall translates almost immediately into scarcity and price. So when you hear that global corn-ending stocks are at their lowest level in more than a decade, that is not a dry statistic. That is the depth of the cushion. And the cushion right now is thin. The system is being asked to walk a tightrope at the exact moment it has the least net beneath it. There is also a structural change worth naming, because it is part of why the modern system feels resilient right up until it does not. Over the last several decades, many countries have moved away from holding large national grain reserves of their own. The logic was efficiency. Storing grain costs money. Why keep huge stockpiles when you can simply buy on the global market whenever you need to? It is the just-in-time logic that reshaped manufacturing, applied to food, and in normal years it works, and it is cheaper. But just-in-time only works as long as someone, somewhere, has the inventory. It depends entirely on the independence assumption, holding, on there always being a surplus region to buy from. A synchronized failure is precisely the scenario that just-in-time food security has no answer for, because in a synchronized failure there is no one to place the order with. The efficiency that looks so smart in the ordinary years is the exact thing that removes the margin in the bad one. Now go to the loss map and check the regions on it, one by one, because the forecasts there are already in, and they are already grim. India. The India Meteorological Department issued its 2026 monsoon forecast, and it called for the monsoon to come in at roughly 92% of the long period average. In the language of monsoon forecasting, that is below normal, and it would be India's first below normal monsoon in 3 years. The reason the department gave for the downgrade was specifically the developing El Niño. The mechanism is not waiting. It is already showing up in the forecast for a country that feeds well over 1 billion people, Indonesia. The Indonesian Meteorological Agency forecast that the 2026 dry season would arrive earlier than the 30-year norm and run drier. The agency went as far as advising farmers to shift their planting calendars and switch to shorter cycle, drought-tolerant crop varieties. That is not a vague outlook. That is an agency telling its farmers to change what they plant because of what is coming. Australia. The Australian forecasting agencies flagged below average rainfall outlooks across key agricultural zones. Australian wheat production was forecast to fall by something like 19%. And Australian cattle were being sold off in record numbers, ranchers offloading their herds ahead of a dry outlook because they could see what was coming for the pasture. I want to pause on that last detail, the cattle being sold off, because it is the kind of thing that does not make headlines but tells you something true. When ranchers start liquidating herds ahead of a forecast, that is not panic and it is not speculation. That is the people closest to the land, the people whose livelihood depends on reading the season correctly, looking at the same outlook the meteorologists published and deciding they believe it enough to act on it now, before the dry actually arrives. A herd takes years to build and a season to lose. Selling it down early is a hard, expensive decision, and the fact that it is happening at scale tells you the people on the ground are taking the El Niño signal as real. The same logic is in the Indonesian agency telling farmers to switch crop varieties, and in the Indian forecast being revised down because of the developing El Niño specifically. These are not distant model outputs, these are agricultural systems, on 3 continents, already changing their behaviour because of what the Pacific is doing. The mechanism we have spent this whole video describing is not waiting for permission. The breadbaskets on the loss map can already feel it coming, and they are already bracing. And here is the thing that ties part 7 into a knot you cannot easily untie. Lay the pieces out one more time and look at the shape. The United States wheat belt, the cushion, drought hit and rated worse than last year. Global grain stocks, the buffer, drawn down, corn carryover at a more than decade low. India, Indonesia and Australia, 3 regions square on the El Niño loss map, all 3 already forecasting below normal rainfall, all 3 already adjusting. There is no version of this picture where the system looks robust. Every single component that is supposed to provide resilience, the cushion, the buffer, the diversity of the loss map regions themselves is already degraded before the official onset. This is the open door. The mechanism does not have to break down a healthy system. It has been handed one that is already coming apart at the seams it most needs to hold. Now lay all of that side by side and look at the shape of it. The United States wheat belt, the cushion, is drought hit. Global grain stocks, the buffer, are thin and getting thinner. India, Indonesia and Australia, 3 of the regions square on the El Niño loss map, are all already forecasting below normal rainfall before the event has officially begun. This is the opposite of a well-buffered system. This is not a healthy body that the mechanism will have to fight through. This is a system that is already bleeding, already weakened, already short, with the granaries drawing down and the breadbaskets stressed, standing in the doorway, watching the thing that synchronizes crop failure walk up the path. And here is the part that ties the knot. All of this, the thin stocks, the stressed breadbaskets, the drought-hit cushion, is happening on a planet that is also, completely independently of the El Niño, the hottest it has been in the entire modern record. That is not a side note. That is not a coincidence in this story. That is the amplifier. And we need to talk about it directly, because the stage this mechanism is about to perform on is hotter than any stage it has ever had before. Part 8. The hottest stage possible. Everything I have described so far, the loaded ocean, the synchronization mechanism, the stressed breadbaskets, all of it is happening on top of a planet that is already running a fever. And I want to spend some time here, because this is the piece that makes the 2026 version of the 1877 mechanism potentially more dangerous than the original. The El Niño is not forming on a neutral, average baseline planet. It is forming on the hottest stage in the modern record. Let me give you the numbers, and these come from the Copernicus Climate Change Service, the European program that monitors the planet's temperature, and they are about as solid and as citable as climate data gets. April of 2026 was the joint third warmest April ever recorded. The global average surface air temperature for the month was 14.89 degrees Celsius. That was 0.52 degrees above the 1991 to 2020 average for April, and it was 1.43 degrees above the estimated pre-industrial level, the temperature of the planet before humans began burning fossil fuels at scale. 1.43 degrees above pre-industrial for a single month, in what is supposed to be a relatively quiet part of the year. I want to make sure the 1.43 figure means something to you, because thrown out as a number it can sound small, and it is not small. There is an international target, the one written into climate agreements, of holding long-term warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial. That is the line that has been treated for years as the threshold we were trying not to cross. And here is a single month, April, in what is supposed to be an ordinary year, already sitting at 1.43, already pressed right up against the line with the El Niño push still to come. The numbers are not abstract anymore. The thing that was discussed for a decade as a future boundary is now the temperature of a recent month. That is the backdrop. That is the planet the synchronization mechanism is being forecast to switch on over. But the air temperature is not even the most important number. The oceans are. April 2026 had the second highest sea surface temperatures ever recorded for the world's oceans outside the polar regions, 21.00 degrees Celsius. And here is the detail that matters most for our story. Copernicus reported record-high sea surface temperatures across large parts of the tropical Pacific. The tropical Pacific, the exact stretch of ocean where the El Niño is forming. And Copernicus tied that warmth explicitly to the ongoing transition toward El Niño conditions. The stage and the actor are the same water. This was not a one-month spike either. March of 2026 had already come in as the fourth warmest March on record, at 1.48 degrees above pre-industrial. And when you take independent analyses that track several major temperature datasets together, 2026 is on course to land as roughly the second warmest year in the entire record, behind only 2024. The planet was already running near record warmth before the El Niño had even officially formed. Normally, El Niño is the thing that pushes a year to a record. This time, the record was already most of the way there on its own, and the El Niño is arriving as an addition on top of it. I want to make that inversion as sharp as I can, because it is genuinely unusual, and it is easy to skate past. In a typical climate record, the hottest years are the El Niño years. That is the normal pattern. The background trend warms the planet slowly, year by year, and then an El Niño comes along and gives it a sharp temporary push, and that pushed year sets the record. 2024, the current record holder, was an El Niño year, and that is exactly the pattern doing what it normally does. What is strange about 2026 is the order of events. The planet is running at or near record warmth first, on the strength of the background trend alone, and the El Niño push has not even been delivered yet. The shove is still coming. So the question is not whether 2026 will be warm, it already is. The question is what happens to an already near record year when the El Niño finally lands its push on top of it, and whether that combination is what tips 2026, or more likely 2027, into being the hottest year humanity has ever measured. And the ocean piece of that deserves its own beat, because the oceans are where this connects straight back to the food story. A warmer ocean is not just a warmer number on a chart. The ocean is the engine room of the whole monsoon system. The monsoons that feed the loss map regions are driven by the temperature contrast between the ocean and the land, by the moisture the ocean gives up into the air. When the global ocean is running at the second highest temperature ever recorded, and the tropical Pacific specifically is setting records, you are not looking at a static backdrop that the El Niño will simply act against. You are looking at an ocean that is already primed, already loaded with heat and moisture, already in an agitated state. The El Niño is not arriving onto a calm sea, it is arriving onto an ocean that is already running hot, and that is the difference between the original 1877 machine and the version that could run in 2026. Now, I want to address something directly, because it was circulating widely in the middle of May, and I want to handle it the way this channel handles things, which is honestly. There was a theory going around online, a claim, that the planet had hit a record daily high temperature on May 13th, and that it was, in the framing being used, likely the hottest May 13th in the last 120,000 years or more. Now, I am not going to name the account that posted it, and I'm not going to treat a single social media post as a citable fact, because it is not one, and I want to tell you plainly why you should treat that specific daily claim with caution. The daily global temperature product that claim is drawn from is a reanalysis, a model-based reconstruction, not a direct measurement, and it runs on a multi-day lag, which means May 13th data was only just becoming available when the claim went up. No official body had confirmed a May 13th record, so I am not going to stand here and tell you May 13th set a record, because the honest answer is that the load-bearing facts are the monthly Copernicus numbers I just gave you, and those are more than alarming enough on their own. We do not need the daily claim, we have the month. But I do want to deal with that 120,000-year framing, because the framing itself is real, and it gets misused in both directions. Where does it come from? It traces back to statements from Copernicus that recent global temperatures likely exceed those of any period since the last interglacial, a warm stretch in Earth's history called the Eemian, which peaked roughly 125,000 years ago, the most recent time the planet's long-term climate was plausibly as warm as today. So the phrase is defensible, but only as a specific kind of statement. It is defensible as a statement about multi-year average warmth. It is not defensible as a literal claim about a single calendar day. And the reason is simple. The paleoclimate record, the proxies scientists use to reconstruct ancient temperatures, things like ocean sediment cores, cannot resolve individual days. They capture averages over decades and centuries. You genuinely cannot compare one Tuesday in 2026 to one Tuesday 120,000 years ago, because the ancient record does not have Tuesdays, it has centuries. So the honest version is this: the planet is very likely warmer now on a multi-year average than at any point in roughly the last 120,000 years. That is a staggering thing to be able to say, and it is true. The single-day version is rhetorically punchy and scientifically unsupportable, and the channel is going to stay on the side of what the science actually supports. And I want to take one more second on why I am being this careful, because it is not pedantry, and it matters for how you should treat everything you hear about this El Niño in the months ahead. There is going to be a lot of coverage. Some of it is going to be careful, and some of it is going to reach for the most dramatic possible framing of every data point, because dramatic framing travels. The trap is that the real story here, the actual Copernicus monthly numbers, the actual El Niño Watch, the actual synchronization science, is already alarming enough that it does not need to be inflated. And every time a claim gets stretched past what the data supports, it hands the people who want to dismiss the whole thing an easy target. If the takeaway someone walks away with is hottest May 13th in 120,000 years, and then that specific claim gets picked apart, the risk is they throw out the entire solid, well-sourced picture along with it. So the discipline cuts in our favour. Stay on the load-bearing facts. The load-bearing facts are strong enough to stand on their own, and they do not wobble when someone pushes on them. So why does any of this matter for the central thread? Why spend this time on the temperature backdrop when the story's about food? Because the warmth is not a separate story. The warmth is the reason the 2026 version of the 1877 mechanism could be worse than the original. Think about it this way. In 1877, That triple whammy, that synchronizing machine, switched on over a planet that was, by today's standards, cool. The oceans had their natural warmth and no more. The El Niño acted on a baseline. In 2026, the same kind of mechanism is being forecast to switch on over a planet already at record heat, with the oceans already at near-record temperatures, with the tropical Pacific itself already setting records, and with the breadbaskets, as we just saw, already stressed and drought-hit. The heat does not replace the mechanism. The heat amplifies it. It is the difference between striking a match in a cool room and striking the same match in a room where the air itself is already hot and dry. Same match. Very different consequences. The warmth is the amplifier bolted onto the machine, and that is why it belongs in this story, and why it belongs right here, just before we put the whole picture together. Part 9. The implication stated plainly. Let me bring you back to where we started. Most people heard the words El Niño Watch this week and filed them as a weather story. A wet winter somewhere, a dry one somewhere else. Something for the reservoir managers and the ski resorts. And I told you at the very beginning that the headline was underselling the story. Now you have everything you need to see why. So let me assemble the whole thing, in order, with every piece in its place. El Niño is the one force in the climate system that the science has now clearly shown can synchronize crop failure across continents, override the independence the entire global food system assumes between its breadbaskets, and pull them down together on a single signal. That is not a fringe claim. That is what the 2019 study in Science Advances found when it tested 4 major climate modes, and only one of them, El Niño, could force globally synchronous failure. 1877 is the proof that this is not theoretical, that the mechanism is real, that it has run at full power before, and that when it did, 50 million people or more died because the monsoon failed across India, China and Brazil at the same time. The 2018 attribution study showed exactly how it happened. The triple whammy, the 3 oceans pulling together. The mechanism itself is a single trans-Pacific circulation pattern with its fingers in 4 corners of an ocean, plus a jet stream that can lock into wave patterns that park drought on linked regions at once. The global food system, its insurance, its reserves, its trade models, is built on the assumption that this mechanism does not exist. And 2026 is walking into the event with the breadbaskets already stressed, the granaries already drawing down, and the planet already at record heat. That is the implication. That is the terrifying implication no one talks about. Not that El Niño is coming, everyone is saying that. The implication is that the world built its food security as though the one force that can break it does not exist. Now I have to do the most important thing in this entire video, and I have to do it without any ambiguity at all, because if you take the wrong thing away from this, I have failed you. I'm not telling you that 2026 is going to repeat 1877. I am not telling you that 50 million people are going to die. A literal repeat of the 1877 death toll is not the probable outcome of this El Niño, and I want to be completely clear about why. The reasons are real, and they are substantial. In 1877, there was no early warning. The Pacific gave no usable notice, because no one was watching it the way we watch it now. Today there are thousands of instruments in the tropical Pacific feeding data in real time, and the watch that was issued this week is itself the proof that the warning system works. In 1877, there was no meaningful relief apparatus, no international food aid infrastructure, no capacity to move grain toward the hungry at scale. Today, however imperfect it is, that capacity exists, and in 1877, as Mike Davis documented, many of the affected populations had been forced, under colonial rule, into volatile global commodity markets they had no power within and no protection from. That specific political structure, the one Davis argued turned drought into mass death, does not exist in the same form today. A major newspaper analysis in the middle of May asked this exact question directly, whether a 2026 El Niño could match the 1877 event, and the careful answer it landed on is the right one. An El Niño rivaling the 1877 ocean event is plausible. A humanitarian catastrophe on the 1877 scale is not the probable result. So the danger in 2026 is real, but it is different in kind. It is not a foregone death toll. It's a danger to food prices, to food security, and to supply stability. And it is a danger that lands hardest, as these things always do, on the poorest, most import-dependent countries, the ones with no cushion of their own. And here is the pathway that actually matters, the realistic one. Modern grain markets are globally integrated and, as we saw, thinly buffered right now. A synchronized yield shock across several major exporters does not need to cause a famine to cause a price spike. It just needs to make the world short. And when staple grains, wheat, rice, maize, spike in price, that price shock travels. It travels straight into the import-dependent countries that buy their calories on the world market, and historically it has translated into food insecurity, hardship, and political instability, even in years when no single crop failed in the catastrophic total sense. We have seen this recently. The food price episodes of 2007 to 2008 and of 2010 to 2011 are the reference class here. Nobody is starving in a field in those examples in the 1877 sense. But prices spiked and the consequences rippled across dozens of countries. That is the realistic shape of the 2026 risk. The 1877 mechanism expressing itself in the 21st century, not as a death toll, but as a price shock landing hardest on the people least able to absorb it. And I want to be precise about why a price shock is the realistic pathway, and not just the polite one. In a globally integrated grain market, you do not need the shelves to be empty for the damage to be done. You just need the price to move. A country that imports most of its wheat does not experience a synchronized El Niño shock as an empty silo. It experiences it as a number on an invoice that suddenly went up by 30 or 40 or 50%. For a wealthy importing country, that is a budget problem. For a poor importing country, where families already spend a large share of their income just on food, that same percentage move is the difference between getting by and not. The grain still exists. It still moves. It just moves toward whoever can pay the new price, and away from whoever cannot. That is the quiet, modern face of the 1877 mechanism. It does not look like a drought on the news. It looks like a line on a budget, and a slow tightening in the places with the least slack to give. The synchrony does not have to kill the harvest everywhere. It only has to make the world short enough, all at once, that the price becomes the weapon. And there is a reason this lands on the poorest hardest, every single time, and it is worth saying out loud. It is not bad luck. It is structure. The countries most exposed are the ones that import the largest share of their staple calories, that hold the thinnest reserves of their own, that have the least fiscal room to subsidize food when the price jumps, and whose populations spend the highest fraction of their income on eating. Every one of those vulnerabilities compounds the others. A synchronized shock to the world's breadbaskets does not distribute its pain evenly. It runs downhill and it pools at the bottom. That was true in 1877, when Mike Davis documented exactly which populations the catastrophe fell on and why. And the modern version, the price shock version, follows the same gradient even though the mechanism at the top is just an ocean. Now, because this is the channel it is, I want to deal directly with the alternative explanations that always cluster around a story like this, and I want to do it briefly and honestly. There is a recurring claim that El Niño itself is being engineered, steered, manufactured by geoengineering programs or weather modification, or some array of transmitters, and I want to tell you why that does not survive contact with the physics. El Niño is a redistribution of heat across an ocean basin that spans roughly a third of the planet's circumference. The amount of energy involved is on the scale of what the sun pours into the tropical Pacific over months. No human program, none, operates within many orders of magnitude of that energy budget. It is not close. It is not even in the same universe of scale. And we know El Niño is natural because we can see it in coral records and in historical accounts, going back centuries, long before any modern technology existed to blame. 1877 itself is the refutation. That El Niño happened in a world with no transmitters, no aircraft, no programs. El Niño is an internal heartbeat of the climate system, and it has been beating for a very long time. There is a second claim, that the agencies are either hiding how bad the food outlook is, or inflating it, depending on which version reaches you, for funding or for control. And the simplest answer is this: the forecasts are public. They come from multiple independent institutions on different continents that do not coordinate and do not even agree with each other. The American Agency, the European Centre, the World Meteorological Organization, the Indian Meteorological Department, the Indonesian Agency, They publish different numbers and different emphases. That is the opposite of a coordinated message. And the one systematic bias the science has actually identified, remember the 2023 follow-up study, runs toward underwarning on synchronized risk, not overwarning. If there is a thumb on the scale, it is pressing down toward reassurance, not alarm. And think about the structure of that claim for a moment, because it collapses under its own weight. A successful cover-up, or a successful coordinated exaggeration, requires control. It requires that the people doing it can actually keep the story aligned. But the El Niño forecast is produced by rival institutions in countries that are not always friendly with each other, using different models, on different schedules, with different scientific cultures, and every one of them publishes openly, in a form anyone can check. The European model, as we discussed, is the most aggressive. The American agency is more measured. The World Meteorological Organization explicitly says there is no consensus on whether the event reaches a high intensity. If this were a coordinated message, it is a remarkably badly coordinated one. The disagreement is not a flaw in the system. The disagreement is the proof the system is not a system in that sense at all. It is a lot of independent scientists looking at the same ocean and arguing about it in public. That is exactly what you would want, and it is the opposite of what a cover-up looks like. And there is a third, the idea that breadbasket failure would be deliberate engineered scarcity, manufactured to consolidate control of the food supply. And here I want to be careful, because there is a real and painful history underneath this anxiety, and dismissing it entirely would be dishonest. Mike Davis's work shows that in 1877, policy choices, human decisions, did turn a drought into a catastrophe. That is real, documented history. But the modern version of the claim confuses that real history of policy failure with intentional engineering. A 2026 food shock, if it comes, would be the physical consequence of an ocean state, not a plot. The honest lesson of 1877 is not that someone engineered it. It is that the human response to a natural trigger can make the difference between a hard year and a catastrophe, and that is a lesson about preparation and policy, not about conspiracy. And then there is the most legitimate counterweight of all, the one that is not a conspiracy at all, and I have to give it its full due here at the end. It is the honest scientific caution. It is genuinely too early to forecast a super El Niño with certainty. The atmosphere has not coupled yet. Spring forecasts have a documented history of failure, and 2014 and 2017 are the cautionary tales. 2 years where the spring models leaned strong and the event never fully arrived. A real ocean scientist writing in mid-May made exactly this point, that the models can look confident, even alarming, when they detect strong subsurface heat, precisely because they may simulate a stronger feedback loop than the real atmosphere ends up producing. That caution is correct, and the channel holds it. But here is the turn, and it is the most important sentence I will say in this video. The uncertainty is about the timing and the magnitude. It is not about the mechanism. Whether this El Niño peaks as a strong event or a super one, whether it bites hard or only moderately, that is genuinely unknown, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something. But whether El Niño can synchronize global crop failure, whether the mechanism is real, that is not in doubt. That is not a forecast. That is settled science, and 1877 already proved it with 50 million lives. So this is where it lands. The terrifying implication no one talks about is not that history is about to repeat itself. History is not a tape that plays again. The implication is quieter than that, and in a way it is worse. The implication is that the modern world, with all its instruments and its models and its global trade, built its food security as if 1877's mechanism does not exist, as if the breadbaskets really do roll their dice separately, as if the pillar holds. And the science of the last decade has shown, clearly, repeatedly, that the pillar is a belief, not a law, and that the one force that can knock it down is the exact force a watch was issued for this week. And the reason no one talks about it is almost banal when you think about it. It is not a cover-up. It is not a secret. It is just that the assumption is invisible precisely because it has worked, most of the time, for most of living memory. The breadbaskets mostly have failed independently year to year, and the system has mostly absorbed those independent shocks, and so the assumption never had to be examined. It became part of the furniture. You do not notice the foundation of a house until something tests it. The independence assumption is the foundation, and a super El Niño on the 1877 pattern is the test it was never designed to take. The science has been quietly publishing the warning for a decade in journals in language careful enough that it never became a headline. Anderson and his colleagues said it plainly, a central pillar, and the sentence sat there, in a paper, waiting for a year when it would matter. This might be that year, it might not. But the watch issued this week is the moment the abstract warning and the live forecast finally line up, and that is why this is the story, and not the weather. The watch is issued. The ocean is loaded with heat in the same class as the strongest events ever recorded. The breadbaskets are already stressed. The planet is at record warmth. And the only thing we genuinely do not know yet, the only piece still missing, is whether the atmosphere will finish what the ocean has already started. We are going to be watching that coupling all summer. We are going to be watching the monsoon forecasts and the wheat ratings and the grain stocks and the slow conversation between the ocean and the sky. Because somewhere in the next few months, the Pacific is going to decide whether 2026 is a story about a weather pattern, or a story about the assumption the whole world forgot it was making.